In the years after the Second World War, Americans believed they understood what war looked like. It was soldiers landing on distant shores. It was flags raised over battlefields. It was victory, declared in public view. But as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, a different kind of conflict began to take shape. There were no formal declarations. No marching armies crossing borders. No headlines announcing the beginning of hostilities. Instead, there were quiet meetings in Washington, locked briefcases, conversations held behind closed doors. In 1947, as tensions with the Soviet Union deepened, the United States created a new institution, the Central Intelligence Agency. Its mission, at least on paper, was clear: gather intelligence, assess threats, protect the nation. But the world was changing rapidly. Communism was spreading across Eastern Europe. China would soon fall to Mao Zedong. The fear inside Washington was not simply of invasion, but of influence, of governments shifting allegiance quietly, of elections tipping in unexpected directions. And so the question emerged: if the battlefield is invisible, how do you fight? Over time, intelligence gathering expanded into something more active, more ambitious. Operations that were not meant to be seen. Actions that would never be debated on the evening news. Some of these efforts were small. Others reshaped entire nations. Most Americans never knew they were happening. Yet their consequences would echo for decades, affecting foreign policy, shaping global alliances, and altering the way citizens viewed their own government. This is not a story of conspiracy. It is a story of power exercised in secrecy, of decisions made in the name of national security, of a republic wrestling with a difficult truth that in order to defend itself, it sometimes stepped into the shadows. To understand America's role in the second half of the 20th century, we must look not only at the wars that were fought in public, but at the ones that were waged in silence. ****. When World War II ended in 1945, Americans hoped they were stepping into a period of lasting peace. The Axis powers had been defeated. Soldiers were coming home. Factories that once produced bombers and tanks began shifting back to automobiles and appliances. There was a sense, at least for a moment, that the worst was behind them. But beneath that optimism, a new rivalry was already forming. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had been built on necessity. Once Nazi Germany fell, that necessity began to fade. What remained were two powerful nations with very different visions of the world. Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet influence. In 1948, Berlin would be blockaded. In 1949, the Soviet Union would detonate its first atomic bomb. China would soon become communist. In Washington, the fear was not merely military invasion, it was ideological expansion. American leaders believed that communism could spread quietly through elections, labor movements, economic instability. A government did not have to be conquered by force. It could shift direction from within. And so, in 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act. It reorganized the nation's military and intelligence structure. It created the Department of Defense. It established the National Security Council. And it gave permanent shape to a new agency, the Central Intelligence Agency. At first, the CIA's mission was straightforward: to collect information, analyze it, and deliver assessments to policymakers. But the early Cold War was not patient. Events were moving quickly. Crises seemed to appear without warning. And inside the corridors of power, some officials began to argue that gathering information was not enough. If the Soviet Union was influencing governments abroad, should the United States not do the same? Quietly, the CIA's authority expanded. A little-known directive, National Security Council Directive 10 authorized covert operations. The language was careful. It spoke of propaganda, economic warfare, sabotage, and support for underground resistance movements. And it added an important phrase: operations that could be plausibly denied. That phrase would define an era. Plausible deniability meant that if an operation became public, the U.S. government could deny direct involvement. No fingerprints, no formal acknowledgement. For a democracy built on transparency and public debate, this was a profound shift. The reasoning was simple. At least on the surface, if the United States openly interfered in another nation's politics, it could spark war. But if it acted quietly, subtly, it might prevent conflict before it escalated. It was the logic of containment carried into the shadows. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, the CIA began experimenting with influence. Money flowed discreetly to political parties in Europe, particularly in Italy and France, where communist movements were gaining strength. Radio broadcasts were funded to counter Soviet messaging. Cultural organizations received support to promote Western ideas. Most Americans had no idea these efforts were underway. They saw the Cold War in headlines, the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, but much of the strategic maneuvering remained invisible. Inside Washington, some believed these covert tools were essential. The atomic age had raised the stakes. A direct confrontation between superpowers could mean nuclear catastrophe. If influence could be exerted quietly, perhaps open war could be avoided. But with secrecy came risk. Who decides when covert action is justified? Who oversees operations that cannot be publicly acknowledged? How far should a democracy go in defending itself? These questions did not dominate public conversation in the early 1950s. The threat of communism felt immediate and real. Loyalty oaths were signed. Congressional hearings investigated alleged subversion. The mood of the country leaned toward vigilance. In that climate, covert action seemed not only acceptable, but necessary. The CIA was still young. Its leaders were learning in real time. Some operations were small and strategic. Others would prove far more ambitious. And soon, the agency would move beyond influencing elections or broadcasting messages. It would help remove a foreign leader from power. First major test of America's new covert capabilities would unfold in a nation thousands of miles away. Iran. There, in 1953, the quiet tools of influence would be used not just to shape opinion, but to reshape a government itself, and the consequences of that decision would echo far beyond the Cold War. In the early 1950s, Iran was not a battlefield. It was a nation rich in history, proud of its sovereignty, and sitting atop vast reserves of oil. That oil had long been controlled not by Iran, but by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Profits flowed outward. Many Iranians believed their country was receiving only a fraction of the wealth drawn from its own. In 1951, a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh took a bold step. He nationalized Iran's oil industry. To many Iranians, Mossadegh was a nationalist, a leader determined to assert control over his country's resources. But to Britain, the move was a direct threat to economic interests. And to officials in Washington, it raised a different concern. The Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union bordered Iran to the north. American policymakers feared that instability in Tehran could open the door to communist influence. If Iran drifted into Moscow's orbit, it would shift the balance of power in the Middle East. At first, the United States hesitated, but as tensions deepened and Britain pressed for action, the CIA began to consider a covert solution. The operation would later be known as Operation Ajax. Its objective was clear: remove Mossadegh from power and strengthen the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was seen as more aligned with Western interests. The tools were not tanks or divisions of soldiers. They were money. Persuasion and manipulation. CIA officers worked with British intelligence to influence Iranian politicians, military officers, and members of the press. Funds were distributed quietly to encourage opposition. Newspaper stories were planted to undermine Mossadegh reputation. Public demonstrations were organized, some genuine, others carefully staged. Tensions escalated through the summer of 1953. On August 15th, an initial attempt to remove Mossadegh faltered. The Shah briefly fled the country. For a moment, it appeared the plan had failed. But 3 days later, on August 19th, coordinated protests filled the streets of Tehran. Crowds clashed. Military units shifted allegiance. Mossadegh's home was attacked. By the end of the day, he had been arrested. The Shah returned to power. From Washington's perspective, the operation was a success. A potentially unfriendly government had been replaced. Iran remained within the Western sphere of influence. The Soviet Union had not gained ground. And yet, the deeper consequences were less visible, at least at first. The Shah would rule for the next quarter century, increasingly through authoritarian means. Political dissent was suppressed. A secret police force, known as Savak, monitored and intimidated opponents. For many Iranians, the memory of 1953 did not fade. They understood that their prime minister had not fallen solely because of internal opposition. Foreign hands had played a role. In 1979, when the Iranian Revolution erupted and the Shah was overthrown, resentment toward the United States was not born overnight. It had roots that traced back to Operation Ajax. In the early 1950s. Few Americans were aware of what had taken place in Tehran. The operation remained classified for decades. It was not openly acknowledged by the U.S. government until many years later. At the time, it seemed like a quiet victory in a larger Cold War struggle, but it established a precedent. If covert action could alter the course of Iran's government, could it be used elsewhere? Inside the CIA, Operation Ajax became a templated demonstration that carefully applied pressure, financial influence, and psychological tactics could reshape political outcomes without deploying American troops. The line between intelligence gathering and intervention had grown thinner, and in Washington, the logic of containment continued to guide decision-making. Another nation in the Western Hemisphere was drawing attention, this time in Central America. There, concerns about land reform and communist influence would lead to another covert operation. Another government would fall, and once again, the consequences would unfold slowly over decades. The shadow war was expanding. In 1954, the focus of American covert action shifted closer to home. Guatemala was a small Central American nation, largely agricultural, with deep economic inequality. Vast tracts of land were owned by a few wealthy families and foreign corporations, while many rural workers lived in poverty. In 1951, a new president took office, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was not a communist, though he had some left-leaning advisors. He was a reformer. He believed Guatemala needed land reform. Unused land from large estates would be redistributed to peasants who could farm it. One of the largest landholders in Guatemala was the United Fruit Company, an American corporation that controlled significant portions of the country's farmland, railroads, and ports. When Arbenz moved to expropriate some of United Fruit's unused land, offering compensation based on tax valuations, the company objected strongly. In Washington, influential voices began raising alarms. This was the early Cold War. The Korean War had recently ended. Senator Joseph McCarthy was warning of communist infiltration. The atmosphere in the United States was tense. Suspicious. To American policymakers, Guatemala began to look less like a domestic reform story and more like a potential foothold for Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized a covert plan. The CIA called it Operation PBSUCCESS. The goal was to remove Renz from power quietly, without a direct American invasion. Unlike Iran, where internal divisions were exploited, Guatemala required a more visible show of pressure. The CIA trained and armed a small force of Guatemalan exiles led by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. The number of fighters was limited. Militarily, they were not overwhelming, but the operation relied heavily on psychological warfare. Radio broadcasts were created to give the impression of a much larger rebel army advancing through the countryside. Leaflets were dropped. Rumors were spread. Aircraft conducted limited bombing runs to create confusion and fear. The objective was not to win a large-scale military victory. It was to convince the Guatemalan military that resistance was futile. Inside Guatemala City, tension mounted. President Renz struggled to rally support. The army's loyalty wavered. Officers questioned whether the United States might escalate its involvement. In June 1954, as the rebel force advanced and radio reports exaggerated its strength, Renz resigned. Castillo Armas assumed power. From Washington's perspective, the operation had succeeded. A government perceived as drifting toward communism had been removed without a formal declaration of war. American influence in Central America was preserved. But, as in Iran, the longer-term consequences were complex. Castillo Armas reversed land reforms. Political opposition was suppressed. Over the following decades, Guatemala would endure periods of instability, coups, and a brutal civil war that lasted more than 30 years. Tens of thousands of lives would be lost. For many Guatemalans, the events of 1954 were not a footnote in Cold War history. They were the beginning of prolonged turmoil. At the time, most Americans were unaware of the CIA's role. Official statements described the situation as an internal uprising. The mechanics of psychological warfare and covert funding remained hidden within the CIA. However, Guatemala reinforced a growing confidence. 2. Governments had been removed in quick succession without large-scale deployment of U.S. troops. Covert action seemed efficient, effective, controlled. But there was an assumption built into that confidence that outcomes could be managed, that new leaders would remain stable allies, that local resentments would not resurface. History would prove more complicated. The Cold War chessboard was expanding, and attention soon turned to a small island nation just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. There, a revolutionary leader named Fidel Castro had taken power, and the next covert operation would not remain hidden for long. By the end of the 1950s, the Cold War had moved to America's doorstep. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government and took control of the island. At first, Washington watched carefully, unsure of exactly what Castro intended. But within months, Cuba began nationalizing American-owned businesses. Political opponents were jailed, and before long, Castro aligned himself openly with the Soviet Union. For the United States, the idea of a Soviet ally just 90 miles from Florida was deeply unsettling. Under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the CIA began developing a covert plan to remove Castro from power. The concept was familiar by now: train exiles, support an uprising, avoid direct American fingerprints. Cuban exiles, many of whom had fled Castro's revolution, were recruited and trained in secret camps in Central America. The plan called for them to land on Cuban soil, spark a rebellion, and inspire the Cuban military and public to rise against Castro. By the time the operation was ready, there was a new president in the White House. John F. Kennedy had taken office in January 1961, young, confident, and eager to show resolve against communism. He inherited the plan and faced a difficult choice: cancel it and appear weak in the struggle against Soviet expansion, or move forward and risk exposure. Kennedy approved the operation, but with limits. He wanted plausible deniability. Direct American military involvement would be restricted. On April 17, 1961, about 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at a remote stretch of coastline known as the Bay of Pigs. Almost immediately, things began to unravel. Castro's forces responded quickly and decisively. The anticipated popular uprising never materialized. Cuban military units remained loyal to Castro. Air support was limited. The element of surprise evaporated within 3 days. The invading force was overwhelmed. More than 100 were killed. Over 1,000 were captured. The world was watching. What had been intended as a covert operation was now front-page news. The United States could not plausibly deny involvement. The embarrassment was public and immediate. President Kennedy took responsibility. Privately, he was furious with the CIA, with his advisors, and perhaps with himself. The failure exposed overconfidence in covert strategy. Assumptions that had worked in Iran and Guatemala did not hold in Cuba, but the consequences reached far beyond Washington. For Castro, the failed invasion was a powerful political victory. It strengthened his grip on Cuba and solidified his alliance with the Soviet Union. The island nation moved even closer to Moscow. And just 18 months later, that alliance would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world would come to nuclear war. Inside the CIA, the Bay of Pigs prompted introspection. Leadership changed. Procedures were reviewed. Yet the belief in covert action did not disappear. If anything, the Cold War climate intensified. Washington concluded that Castro must still be contained, if not removed. New covert efforts were launched, including sabotage operations and even assassination plots. The shadow war deepened. For the American public, especially those who lived through those anxious years, the Bay of Pigs became a symbol, a reminder that secrecy carries risks, that intelligence agencies, however capable, can miscalculate. But it also underscored something else. The United States was engaged in a global struggle where victories and failures often unfolded in places most Americans would never visit. Decisions made quietly in conference rooms, their consequences echoing for generations. And even as the focus remained on Cuba, another conflict was intensifying thousands of miles away. In Southeast Asia, covert operations would blend into open war, and the line between shadow conflict and full-scale military engagement would become harder than ever to see. By the early 1960s, America's attention was fixed on Vietnam, but next door, in the small, mountainous nation of Laos, another war was quietly unfolding, largely out of public view. Laos was officially neutral under international agreements signed in Geneva in 1962. On paper, it was not supposed to become a battlefield in the Cold War. In reality, it already was. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of supply routes used by North Vietnam, ran through eastern Laos. Weapons, food, and troops moved southward along these jungle paths, supporting communist forces in South Vietnam. For Washington, the trail posed a serious problem. The United States was escalating its involvement in Vietnam. If North Vietnam could operate freely across Laotian territory, American strategy would be undermined. But because Laos was officially neutral, a large-scale American invasion would violate international agreements and risk global backlash. So once again, the CIA was tasked with finding a quieter solution. The operation that followed would become known as the Secret War, rather than deploying American combat divisions. The CIA recruited and armed local fighters, most notably members of the Hmong ethnic minority. These forces were led by a charismatic general named Vang Pao. American operatives worked closely with Hmong units, training them, supplying them, and coordinating air support. Air America, a CI-operated airline, transported personnel and equipment across rugged terrain. Bombing campaigns intensified. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos, making it, per capita, one of the most heavily bombed countries in history. And yet, for years, the American public heard little about it. There were no formal declarations of war, no nightly news briefings devoted to Laos. The conflict existed in the shadows, briefly mentioned, rarely explained. For the Hmong fighters, the stakes were immediate and personal. They were defending their villages, their land, and their families from communist forces aligned with North Vietnam. Casualties mounted. Entire communities were displaced. The war in Laos became intertwined with the broader conflict in Vietnam, blurring the distinction between covert action and conventional warfare. Inside Washington, officials believed this strategy was necessary. Disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, contain communist expansion, support allies without triggering a wider international crisis. But secrecy carried a cost. When the Vietnam War became increasingly controversial at home, revelations about the secret bombing of Laos fueled public distrust. Many Americans felt they had not been told the full extent of their country's involvement in Southeast Asia. For the people of Laos, the consequences lingered long after American forces withdrew from the region in the early 1970s. Unexploded ordnance remained scattered across farmland and villages. Decades later, farmers and children would still encounter bombs that had never detonated. For the Hmong community, the end of the war brought new hardship. When communist forces consolidated control in Laos in 1975, many Hmong who had supported the CIA fled the country, seeking refuge in Thailand and eventually the United States. Their story of alliance, sacrifice, and displacement became part of the larger American narrative of the Cold War. The secret war in Laos revealed something significant about covert action. It could grow. What began as limited assistance and advisory support expanded into ASEAN. Sustained campaign involving thousands of local fighters and extensive air operations. The boundary between hidden conflict and open war became difficult to define. And as the Vietnam era closed, America entered a period of reckoning. Congressional investigations in the 1970s began, examining intelligence agencies more closely. Questions were raised about oversight, legality, and accountability. But the Cold War did not end. The battleground shifted once more, this time to the mountains of Central America. And there, in the 1980s, covert action would collide with domestic politics in a way few could have predicted. By the early 1980s, the Cold War had entered a new phase. The Vietnam War was over. The Soviet Union remained a formidable rival. And in Central America, political upheaval once again drew Washington's attention. In 1979, a leftist revolutionary movement known as the Sandinistas overthrew Nicaragua's longtime dictator. The new government aligned itself with Cuba and maintained ties to the Soviet bloc. For President Ronald Reagan, this development was deeply troubling. Reagan believed the United States faced a global ideological struggle. In his view, communist movements in Latin America threatened regional stability and American interests. To counter the Sandinistas, the United States began supporting rebel groups known collectively as the Contras. Many of these fighters operated from neighboring Honduras and Costa Rica, launching attacks against Nicaraguan government targets. The CIA played a role in training and advising these forces. Funding flowed to sustain the effort. But inside the United States, The policy became controversial. Reports emerged of human rights abuses committed by Contra forces. Critics questioned whether supporting them aligned with American values. In response, Congress passed a series of measures known as the Boland Amendments, restricting the use of federal funds to aid the Contras in overthrowing the Nicaraguan government. The message was clear. Official support had limits, yet the administration remained determined to continue backing the rebels. What followed would become one of the most complex political scandals of the era. In secret, senior officials developed a plan that connected two separate foreign policy challenges. At the time, several Americans were being held hostage in Lebanon by groups linked to Iran. The United States had publicly declared it would not negotiate with terrorists. And yet, behind the scenes, arms were sold to Iran despite an arms embargo. The idea was that improving relations might help secure the release of hostages. But the plan went further. Proceeds from those arms sales were diverted without congressional approval to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Arrangement was concealed through a network of intermediaries and offshore accounts. For a time, it remained hidden. Then, in November 1986, a Lebanese newspaper revealed the arms for hostages transactions. American media quickly began investigating. The story widened. The public learned that funds had been secretly redirected to support the Contras, circumventing congressional restrictions. The scandal became known as the Iran-Contra affair. Televised hearings followed in 1987. Americans watched as government officials testified under oath. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who became a central and controversial figure in the drama. Questions filled the air. Who authorized the operations? Did the president know? Had the constitutional balance of power been compromised? President Reagan addressed the nation, acknowledging that mistakes had been made, but maintaining that his intentions were honorable. Investigations led to several indictments and convictions, though some were later overturned or pardoned. Beyond the legal outcomes, Iran-Contra left a lasting impression on the American public. It revealed how covert operations, conducted in secrecy and driven by geopolitical urgency, could intersect with domestic law and democratic oversight. Unlike earlier covert actions hidden for decades, Iran-Contra unfolded in real time on television screens across the country. For many Americans, especially those who had lived through Watergate just a decade earlier, it raised familiar concerns about accountability and transparency. It also signaled a shift. The Cold War was nearing its final years. Within a few years, the Berlin Wall would fall. The Soviet Union would dissolve. Yet the questions raised by Iran-Contra did not disappear with the end of that global rivalry. They lingered. How far should a nation go in pursuit of security? What role should secrecy play in a democracy? And who, ultimately, decides the boundaries of covert power? As the 20th century drew to a close, America's shadow wars did not end. They evolved into new forms, new regions, new technologies. And once again, the line between what was known and what remained hidden would grow uncertain. Asterisk, asterisk, when the Cold War ended in 1991, many Americans believed a new era had begun. The Soviet Union was gone. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The decades-long standoff between superpowers had finally come to a close. For a moment, it seemed like the age of covert ideological warfare might be over, but history rarely moves in straight lines. On September 11, 2001, everything changed. Terrorist attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda struck New York and Washington. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The sense of security that many Americans had felt after the Cold War vanished in a single morning. Within days, President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror. This new conflict would look very different from the Cold War. There were no superpower summits. No clearly defined battle lines. The enemy was decentralized spread across countries, operating in secret networks, and once again, intelligence agencies moved to the center of American strategy. In Afghanistan, CIA officers were among the first Americans on the ground. Working with local militias, they coordinated airstrikes and helped topple the Taliban regime within weeks. But the fight did not end there. Over the next 2 decades, covert operations expanded across multiple regions: Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, Syria. One of the defining features of this era was the rise of drone warfare. Unmanned aerial vehicles allowed the United States to target suspected militants in remote areas without deploying large numbers of troops. These operations were often classified, conducted under legal authorities that were debated intensely in Washington. Supporters argued drones reduced risk to American soldiers and allowed precise strikes against dangerous targets. Critics questioned civilian casualties, transparency, and the long-term strategic impact. Another controversial aspect of the war on terror involved interrogation practices and secret detention sites, sometimes referred to as black sites. After 9/11, the CIA was authorized to detain and question high-value suspects outside traditional court systems. Some of the interrogation methods used were later widely criticized as torture. When details emerged through media reports and congressional investigations, public debate intensified. How should a democracy respond to terrorism? Where is the line between security and civil liberties? What level of secrecy is justified in the name of protection? In 2011, one of the most significant covert operations of the era took place. After years of intelligence gathering, U.S. forces located Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The mission to capture or kill him was carried out by Navy SEALs in a nighttime raid. Though executed by military personnel, it relied heavily on years of intelligence work, surveillance, informants, analysis. When President Barack Obama announced bin Laden's death, crowds gathered outside the White House and at Ground Zero. For many Americans, it felt like justice, but it did not mark the end of covert conflict. Instead, it underscored how intelligence operations had become deeply integrated into modern warfare. Unlike earlier eras, today's covert actions often unfold in a world of digital surveillance, cyber operations, and real-time global media. Information leaks quickly. Satellite imagery is publicly available. Whistleblowers can release classified documents to the world in seconds. The shadows are thinner than they once were, and yet, secrecy remains central to national security strategy. Cyber operations now target infrastructure and elections. Intelligence agencies monitor extremist networks online. Special operations forces conduct missions that may never be publicly acknowledged. The tools have evolved, but the underlying tension remains. For decades, the United States has relied on covert action as a way to influence events without triggering full-scale war. Sometimes those efforts achieved strategic goals. Sometimes they produced unintended consequences that lasted generations. From Iran and Guatemala, to Cuba and Laos, to Nicaragua, and into the war on terror. Each chapter reflects the same fundamental challenge. How does a nation defend itself in a dangerous world without losing sight of its own principles? Today, the debate continues. Because in the modern era, the battlefield is not always visible, and the most consequential decisions may still be made far from public view, quietly, carefully, and sometimes controversially in the enduring world of the shadow war. For more than 70 years, the United States has operated in two worlds at once. One is visible: public speeches, congressional debates, soldiers in uniform, Policies announced from the White House podium. The other world is quieter, but it exists in classified briefings. Encoded cables. In operations that may never be fully acknowledged. From the early days of the Cold War to the War on Terror, covert action has been woven into American foreign policy. Sometimes it was framed as necessity, sometimes as strategy, sometimes as the only option short of open war. Presidents from Harry S. Truman to George Bush and beyond faced the same fundamental dilemma: how to confront threats in a world where waiting could be dangerous, but acting openly could be catastrophic. In some cases, covert operations achieved their immediate objectives. In others, the consequences unfolded slowly, reshaping regions and relationships for decades. What makes the story complex is this: secrecy can protect lives, but it can also shield mistakes. A democracy depends on informed citizens, yet intelligence work depends on silence. That tension has never fully been resolved. As technology advances, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, global surveillance, the shadows grow more sophisticated. But the core question remains unchanged: how far should a free society go to defend itself? The history of America's shadow wars is not simply a record of missions and operations. It's a mirror reflecting the nation's values, fears, ambitions, and contradictions. Because in the end, the most important battle may not be fought overseas, but it may be the ongoing struggle to balance power with principle, security with liberty, strength with accountability. And that struggle is far from over.